And it's about a boy that gets connected with a black stallion, and the experiences that they have together and how they sort of grow together over a time period. We're doing a series that we call Dark Horses because all of us in our times of struggle, we gravitate towards the stories that kind of show what we would call a dark horse, or somebody that's unknown, sort of a little mysterious. Dark horses, the term actually comes from horse racing, where there's a horse that is on the field that people really don't know how to evaluate. It's mysterious. It hasn't really been tested. It hasn't been tried. People don't know, how to hedge their bets or what the payoff is going to be. They don't know how to categorize it. And so it's sort of almost like out of nowhere, this horse comes that kind of wins the day. We often talk about stories that we love to hear. We talk about, the Cinderella story, right? Out of nowhere, just from rags to riches. And we love stories that have the underdog that sort of wins the day. I mean, think about the movies that you love, right? The Rocky movie, the first one, as well as probably the 4 or 5 that were after it. The story about the bum from Philadelphia that rises to take the championship. Or what about even, other, Star Wars? Luke, who's just in this out of the way, do nothing, but there was something in him he didn't even realize himself until he gets involved in this global, this universal conflict that was playing out. And of course, many of you have watched the movie Braveheart of William Wallace that comes out of nowhere, out of poverty, to kind of lead a nation. Well, there's one thing about dark horses that they all seem to have in common, and that is a moment of testing. A moment in time where they are evaluated for how they respond in a moment of a crisis. And that's what really defines what it is to be a dark horse, that in that moment of testing, how do they respond? And so that's why we did the promo, and we're going to be using that movie, some movie clips from that movie, because there comes a moment when the black stallion is a beautiful horse, but it's not a thoroughbred. It's not, how does it compete against all of the ones with the right breeding, the right upbringing, the right training? This wild stallion finally takes on, the biggest horse race of the century. How does it respond? And of course, there's conflict that develops. There's anxiety, there's stress. What's going to happen? People don't know. And I think even for us as Christians, as a church, we find ourselves in a moment of testing. I don't know if you recognize it or not. I don't know if you're just in a hunker-down siege mentality of saying, maybe we can get through this and we'll get back to normal, whatever normal is. We are in a moment of testing. We have to define what we are going to be and what we're going to become. And as a part of this time during Lent is an ideal time for us to be in a wilderness experience and say, how am I responding? What's going on the inside? To basically take a look in the mirror, looking past all of the foibles, all of the mistakes, and say, who is God calling me to be? And so we talked about dark horses, and that dark horses always have this moment where your faith should scare you a little, but it should energize you a lot. I mean, it should be something that really gets into the very core of who you are and really says, my life is so much more than just what I do for a living. About the day-to-day grind, the daily routines, the going through the motions, the paying of the bills. My life has a global transformational power within it. Jesus is calling me to be the light of the world. Well, last week I showed you a particular picture that really struck a chord with a lot of people. Do you remember this picture from last week? This picture from Iwo Jima? As a matter of fact, there's sculptures, there's statues that remember this moment in time. But I want to ask you in your own thinking, why does this strike a chord with us? I mean, here you have these 6 men on this battle in Iwo Jima, in the middle of the battle, by the way. This isn't at the end. This isn't when everybody else goes home and they say, hey, wouldn't it be cool to go to the top of the hill? This is in the middle of the battle. And they do something so heroic, but what is it that they're doing? What is it that it's really all about? And I think one of the things that really strikes a chord with all of us, it's the incredible risks that they take, right? In the middle of the battlefield, they raise their banner. And as a result of that, they inspire everybody else that is around. They're on the top of the only mountain on this little volcanic island of Iwo Jima. And they find their way to the top, and they have this idea of staking a claim, raising their flag, right? Putting their flag in the ground and saying, we're here, we're not going away. The question is for all of us is, are we willing to take that kind of risk? Are we willing to step up and to do what other people think can't be done? Because here's the other thing, is all the other people that are on the island are kind of caught up in this moment. They're kind of caught up in this sacred moment of like going, yes, we can. You know, there's so many people right now that are willing to give up. They're willing to kind of roll over and give in. They're waiting for somebody or a community to stand up and say, this is who we are. We're not going away. So the question is for all of us as we think about our own journey this time is, what is God inviting us to be a part of? What testing are we going through that we need in our own life to find out who we are and who we can become? See, I think that right now we're in a moment where we have to define who we are. And I love this quote by Brene Brown. She said, Christianity is really all about choosing courage over comfort. Now that sounds kind of different than what most people expect. It's about choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy. It's practicing your values, not just professing them. Now, we live in a culture that loves to profess its values. People love to talk the talk, but they're interested about what does it mean for a community to actually live them out. And so this morning, we're talking about dark horses. And in the midst of the tumultuous time, so many people have been coming in, you know, and all of the chaos that is going on, saying, where is God in all of this? What is God doing? How do we get through this, and how do we get back to where we need to be? Well, this morning, if you don't mind, I want to spend some time talking about the one person who, to me, typifies the classic dark horse story. The one person that everybody should know, the one book of the Bible that everybody should read. It's a wonderful kind of rags to riches story that transforms people and saves a nation. The Book of Esther. Esther is a short book, but it's powerful. It talks about how God takes all of these pieces, and in the background you say they just seem like they were put in the right places at the right time. And so in the Book of Esther, we learn that God often puts the right person in the right place at the right time. The challenge for us is oftentimes we don't see the beginning from the end. We see our momentary sliver. But the question that I want to ask you, and I want you to think about as we talk about Esther's story this morning, is, are you the right person in the right place and at the right time? So let's jump in and let's learn about what Esther's story is and how Esther rises from just a young girl in obscurity into the palace, into a place where she can save a nation. So let's jump in and let's read a little bit about her story, beginning in the very first chapter. Now, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Now, Xerxes was king over Persia in the 4th century. Persia is the land that is currently Iran and Iraq. Now, he ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. The celebration, he ended up having a banquet, and the celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. So let's kind of take a look. This is his kingdom. Kush is actually all the way over on that side, in Ethiopia. Cush is Ethiopia. So he is in charge of 127 provinces, everything from India all the way over to Ethiopia. And he offers this banquet in order to impress everybody, to kind of show off his military power so that people don't get out of control, to bring everybody into the same background. So he's throwing this great party. And in the midst of the party, he wants to show off everything that he has. So it tells us that on the 17th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, which is a biblical way of saying that he was about 3 sheets to the wind, he decided that he wanted to show off everything that he had. And one of the things that he wanted to show off was his queen. So he told the servants to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Now, oftentimes I've heard different commentaries say, well, now, as we're going to find out later, Queen Vashti kind of objects to this kind of idea. And somebody said, well, she's queen. Shouldn't she be in a position of authority to go out, wear her royal crown, and go out? So I want to reinterpret a little bit about why Queen Vashti decides to object to this request that cost her so much. So he told his servants to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, and only her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So now do you kind of begin to understand where Queen Vashti decides that it's important, while you have all of these drunk nobles, to come before them in such a state? Here's the question for the king. Decisions that you make while you're trying to impress others are rarely good ones. The king is trying to impress everybody, and he's trying to show them everything that he's got, and he's trying to show them the power that he's got. And how often do we make decisions that we often regret, choices that we often regret, simply because we're trying to impress people that we really didn't want to impress after all? A couple of weeks ago, remember, we did a series talking about what is the wise thing to do? So oftentimes I would want to go back to the king and say, King, is that really the wise thing for you to do? Now, of course, Queen Vashti doesn't respond the way he anticipates. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come, and this made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Now, she had to have known that this was going to cause problems. She had to know, but the great thing about Queen Vashti, the thing that we remember about her, is her boundaries. You see, the problem is if you create boundaries, if people throw a fit because you've set a boundary, it's probably all the more evidence that the boundary was needed after all. If people go off at the deep end because you say this is where our relationship ends, maybe that was necessary after all. Because here's what you find actually in chapter 2, which I find really fascinating. In the very first verse of chapter 2, but after Xerxes' anger had subsided, what did he do? Well, he began to think about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. Up until this point, he wasn't really thinking it through. He was just reacting. And it cost her her position. It cost him some credibility. And so all of a sudden, in the moment of turmoil, of political turmoil within the palace, there is a vacancy, for Vashti has set boundaries that are necessary. One of the things that we all do in our own lives is we have to set boundaries. What is it that is important to you? Whether it's church, whether it's faith, whether it's your family, whether it's your community, where do they begin and where do they end? Well, we find that now that this vacancy has happened, this uncertainty, this chaos is happening in the kingdom, it creates an opportunity for somebody else to become queen. And the nobles have a great idea. They said, how about we have a beauty pageant? And whoever wins the beauty pageant will be your queen. Well, King Xerxes thinks that that's a wonderful idea. What a great suggestion made by a bunch of older white guys. So they have this beauty pageant, and there's this one Jewish girl who's hiding her Jewishness, known as Queen Esther. And Esther rises to prominence and wins the beauty pageant. And it goes on to say that God has put into place the right person. Now, at this moment in time, we just say that this is just a random story. We don't see how this is playing out. What is Esther really doing? Right? I mean, sure, she's gone from rags to riches, and it's great for her, but what's the point of our story here? It tells us that Xerxes was so delighted with her that he had set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. Now, the important part here that I want to keep you well focused is the reason that they told that story of Vashti about her setting boundaries is that's going to come into play in a little bit. We also find that she has a cousin by the name of Mordecai. And Mordecai is kind of a counselor to Esther, guiding her, kind of that moral code, that moral guidance that she needs from time to time. And it also reminds us that Esther is the right person, but Mordecai is in the right place. It tells us that afterwards, after this had happened, Mordecai is outside the city gates when he hears about a plot. And he gives this information to Queen Esther. And she told the king about it and gave Mordecai the credit, gave her the report. So now this is written in the book of the king, of things that have done. Now, one of the things that I want you to draw your attention to is the parallel that is beginning to exist between the story of Esther and Mordecai is very similar. You're going to see this all actually play out again in the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. The story is thrown into prison, and he tells a positive thing that gets written down, but not really honored. So the point here for Mordecai is to do the right thing no matter where you are. It would have been so easy for Mordecai to say, hey, that's not my job, that's not my problem, somebody else's, but he makes sure he does the right thing even when it doesn't benefit him directly. See, one of the challenges that we all have, especially in our own generation, is what value does it add to me? What do I get out of it? Mordecai saw this as being at the right place at the right time. So here's the lesson that I want us to remember out of this. If you're not faithful in the little things, the little opportunities, you won't be ready for the big things. And this little thing, even though it seems insignificant, this little plot that was taken care of, it's really going to play out later on with his credibility when the big things begin to develop. So you probably know the story. As things go on, the king develops a noble that rises to prominence. First of all, we have Esther. Esther is the protagonist. She's the positive force that's going to be happening here. But we also now develop an antagonist, which is Haman. Haman rises to prominence, but like so many others, he begins to be consumed by his position of power. And so even though that he's next to the king, it's just never enough. He's always got to have just a little more. Somebody once said to Nelson Rockefeller, they said, he's got all of this wealth. How much is enough? And he said, it's always just a little more. See, there's so often times that we are always looking for the next step. We want that promotion, but then we want just a little more. What's the next one after that? And that's what got caught up with Haman. Haman wants just a little bit more, and when he sees that Mordecai, who is dedicated to his faith, will not bow down to him, he is consumed with rage. And it isn't just for him, but his rage is so intense that he has to eliminate all of the Jews. And so we find out that these boundaries become even more. So all of the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever they passed by, for so the king commanded. But Mordecai refused to show him respect. So we come to that moment in time where Haman says, well, then I'm going to eliminate not just Mordecai, not just to deal with him personally, but with everyone that is just like him. And so he makes this edict for genocide of all of the Jews throughout the entire nation. They're not like us. They don't belong here. If Mordecai is going to act like this, then they all have to go. And so this becomes a global issue, a national issue that is so important to both Mordecai and now with Esther. And now we come back to the moment of Vashti. Mordecai goes to Esther and says, Esther, you have to go to the king. And of course, Esther says, did you just see what happened to Vashti? I'll lose my position. More importantly, I could lose my head. The law says if anybody goes into the king uninvited, it means death. And of course, Mordecai offers these profound words that speak to us over and over again. He says to her, you are the right person. You are the right person. He said, Esther, who knows but that you were made queen for such a time as this? Now, we have talked about this as a church. We've thought about this over the last year, about how God has been preparing us for this moment in time. I mean, from way back when we talked about implementing certain things, we started a year ago to start talking about what could we do for live streaming, and here we are over the last year. We've been thinking about, well, how would we do online giving? And we started PushPay over a year and a half ago in order for things to be in place. We began putting together the website. We've been upgrading the website well before this whole isolation in order for this moment in time. So the question is how do you know that you were not made for a moment like this? This is our time. This is our moment. This is what God has been preparing us for. Now, we don't see the beginning from the end, and we're not exactly sure how this will all play out, but we have to take great confidence and great energy in knowing that God has placed us for this moment in time to ask, how will you respond? What will you do? So the question is you are the right person. You, right where you are, listening at home, you are the right person for this moment in time. The next thing to ask is, this is the right place. Who is waiting for us to act? Right? I mean, for Esther, it was kind of obvious. It was the entire nation is under threat. The integrity of the Jewish people, the integrity of the church is at stake. This is the right time. This is our moment in time. If you'd have come to any of us a year ago, 2 years ago, and said, can you even imagine a situation where the church would be shut down for almost an entire year? People would not be able to gather for an entire year. It would have been unthinkable. I can't even imagine a situation where that happened, and yet here we are. This is an unprecedented time. That word has been used over and over again. Unprecedented. What is our perspective of what God is doing? And yet, even in the book of Esther, God is not a burning bush. God is not dividing the Red Sea. But you can see the hand of God moving through the right people. So this is the right place for us to come together. And of course, Esther finally comes to the realization, this is my time. Mordecai says to Esther, if you keep quiet at a time such as this, God will still fulfill his purpose, but this is your time. And so Esther responds, if I perish, I must perish. But she responds by asking about spiritual discipline. She said, before I go to the king, let us prepare ourselves with 3 days of prayer and of fasting. Now, for all of us in our time of Lent, spiritual disciplines are useful means. They open us to the possibility of what God is doing. They allow us to experience God in the fullness, to experience all that God has in store. So during this season of Lent, I certainly implore you and I encourage you to involve yourself in the spiritual disciplines that have strengthened God's people through the ages, whether it's this time of worship, it's prayer, it's Bible study, it's engaging in what God is doing so that we can see with some clarity the path before us. So you know the rest of the story. Esther goes into the king and invites him and Haman into a banquet, And they come and they share. And basically what she is doing is she is establishing her credibility. She comes in, she establishes a banquet, and she says, and the king says, well, Esther, what can I do for you? And she says, I want you to come back for another banquet. But that evening, just by coincidence, the king can't sleep. And so he says, whenever you can't sleep, you always read the minutes of the last board meeting. And so he goes back and he opens up, and there in the middle of that reading, it just so happens that there's this story of Mordecai. And he said, has anything ever been done to Mordecai? He said, no, nothing has ever. He said, well, then we should honor him for how he has saved. And so what you see is all of a sudden the coincidences begin to align up and God begins to move. And all of a sudden the plot of Haman is revealed and the Jews are saved. Now, I wanted to end this morning by talking about this dark horse, about the historical impact of this moment in time. It's the Feast of Purim. Purim is a Hebrew word that means lot. If you remember in the story, if you kind of read through the Book of Esther, you'll recognize that they cast lots, Haman cast lots, for the day that the Jews would be executed. And it's called Purim. Well, once they were saved, they celebrate on March 7th every year a feast to celebrate the work of Esther and of stepping in. Now, the historical implications of that is the story is that during the time of the Holocaust in the Second World War, of all of the feasts that the Nazis would not allow the Jews to celebrate, of all of the feasts that they had, the only one they did not allow them to celebrate was the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Esther. You could celebrate. If you wanted to celebrate Passover, that's fine. A deliverer will come to you. The power of the Feast of Purim, of the dark horse, is recognizing that an individual within the midst can so transform a nation, can save the entire nation. The last thing that they wanted to be involved with is recognizing that individuals can have that kind of power. That individuals can rise up and make a difference in a nation, among a people, in a church, in a community. They didn't want that to get out. And so the challenge for us in the dark horses is to ask for all those that are watching online, for those that are committed to the church, ask, are you the dark horse in this generation? We've been talking about raising that banner for the church, raising that banner in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the turmoil, for people to gather together and say, we're planting our flag, we're not going away. God is doing a new thing among us this season. So we're talking about discipleship, about the challenges, about asking the question, can you find where Jesus is? Jesus invites his disciples to say, come follow, come and see. They go a little deeper and he says, come follow me. But eventually they get to a place where he says, go and do likewise. Where do you find yourself in your own discipleship journey? Have you taken time off? Have you forgotten what God is really doing? Have you begun to dream again? Because I believe that within and among us are those dark horses, those rags to riches, those people that from the humblest of beginnings will begin to transform the world. And maybe that person is you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we gather this morning to say thank you for the witness of Esther, for her strength of character, for her willingness to risk everything for your people and for your kingdom and your glory. But we take from her example the witness that we too are called to step out. We too are called to be your disciples. We too are called to be your witnesses, to bear light in a dark and weary world. Help us, Father, as we struggle with our own identity, to listen and to feel your presence. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.